Hi, Will. There are a couple big things I want to talk with you about with regard to this paper. Hopefully, you'll get this before tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to think through some of these problems, or at least ask me questions about them before I see you. First things first. We need to talk about your writing a little bit. There are three or four instances in your paper where it's difficult to understand what you mean. So, if we can go ahead and get started with the first line right here, the right to bear arms. This is the Second Amendment, but what does this really mean? Um, That's a little bit awkward to try and read through. And then if I come down here and I look at the first line of the second sentence, gun control has long been debated to be taking away the Second Amendment. That's not what gun control is. And just the same way that the right to bear arms is not necessarily the Second Amendment. You're conflating some things here. And we need to be more rigorous with our language so that the reader can understand what you're actually trying to say. Um, Now, the question that you have, though, of what is gun control and how should it be implemented in the United States, I think that's an interesting question. Um, However, as you jump down here, um, you get to this right to this question about who should or should not have guns. The longest running conversation that's happened in the United States about who should or should not have guns is the question of what exactly the Second Amendment says. So if we look at it, the Second Amendment says that people have the right to bear arms for the sake of maintaining a militia. I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but please feel free to go back and look at it on your own. Um, Now, the question there is, and the way it was originally interpreted was the right to bear arms existed for that reason, to have a militia. But people today tend to interpret it by saying you have the right to bear arms individually so that you can later come together and create a militia when necessary. Um, so there's been this divide in the way that we think about the language of the Second Amendment. Do we have the right to bear arms simply when we need to create militias, or do we have the right to bear arms individually so that later, if necessary, we can create militias? But ultimately, this question of militias has been central to the issue. Um, and that's something I think that you really need to try and play with here. Because even this article that you have here from Robert Levy, it doesn't begin to play into this very serious issue about who should and why should people have guns. Um, you instead are playing with the question of reasonable persons should be left able to fashion reasonable restrictions, a framework for gun control in the aftermath of Newtown. However, nothing came out of this. So what you're playing with here is hypotheticals, not anything that actually happened. You have an interview here, an interview with who? Who's Brady and why am I concerned with him? Now, as you start to come down here, you talk about some information, some surveys, and who approves of particular gun control measures. This is good. This provides a lot of information. I think this is something we're talking about. But we're going to have to discuss your formatting here. 27, 27, 28, 27. What are these things I'm looking at right here? This makes me think that you simply cut and pasted this out of somebody else's article. So I have real questions here about what I'm looking at right now. We need to be able to discuss that when I see you. Is there any evidence that making the restrictions that you suggest above would actually make the public safer? Do we have anything from another country or another place, a test study that's been done, that would suggest to us that the things that are being offered up here and which the public by and large approves of would actually make any difference? Not to say that we shouldn't try these things, even if they wouldn't by themselves make a difference. Of course, with drunk driving, we are willing to say, well, you know, we don't want people to drive drunk, but rather than outlawing alcohol, let's say we change the driving or we change the age at which you're allowed to consume alcohol, and then we say you have to wear your seatbelt, and then we say you're not allowed to drink and drive the car, and then we keep moving these things around to try to reduce the number of people who are hurt by drunk drivers. I think there's an analogy that we can draw here, which is if we were to outlaw guns, would that actually stop people from using them criminally in the same way that outlawing alcohol may or may not stop people from using it criminally? Or should we try to chip away at gun use in the same way that we chip away at alcohol use, especially alcohol use on the roads? And even if each one of those issues would not ultimately change the number of people who are being killed or just change it significantly, is it still worth doing because it is simply the right thing to do? I think all these questions are applicable to any conversation about gun use and something that maybe you should consider. Anyway, with all that being said, just a couple things for you to think about. Please give it a shot and we'll have a conversation tomorrow.